Okay, I'm now going to read page 59 of Simoncini's book, and this section is called The Bluff of Genetics and of the Scientifically Proven. This is page 59. Each scientific problem is, or should be, first of all, a theoretical problem that is used to construct a tract that leads to the resolution of a certain morbid condition, that is, to an appropriate therapy. That is, to an appropriate therapy. The resolution of a certain condition, that is, to an appropriate therapy. Once the cause of the disease has been identified, the therapeutic, practical approach should be in function of the cause. Unfortunately, this does not happen in modern oncology because no one, neither in the official medicine nor in so-called alternative medicine, goes through the trouble of conceiving a specific logical subject as the origin of neoplastic disease. In spite of this fundamental deficiency, oncologists and researchers put the concept of the scientifically proven in first place in their evaluation of a theory or of a therapeutic system concerning tumors. This concept is the sole and indispensable passport for the acceptance or rejection of any proposal for study or therapy. Schematically, this concept is based on some simple principles of Galilean origin, or more recently of Popperian origin, which must be observed by those who want to progress in the path of science. These are: 1. The formulation of a hypothesis following the observation of a phenomenon or combined phenomena. 2. The reproduction and study of the phenomenon so that it can be analyzed. 3. The formulation of a law of judgment describing the phenomenon and allowing the making of predictions and the course of the scientist's actions. 4. The ability to share the results obtained with all other researchers, which enables others to make use of what has been discovered or acquired as the basis of further studies, verifications, and applications. Who could ever disagree with this? Who could ever refuse such guarantee for the scientific world as well as for society? Nobody would ever dream of deviating from such a system. A scientist who neglected to follow such a method of study would not only not go far in his research, but would surely end up being isolated. In reality, current oncology is an extremely leaky vessel, and it does no good to try to hang on to the scrupulousness of the scientific method when the practical results have eluded us for decades. What is the cause of such a failure? What are the problems and the misunderstandings in such a state of affairs? No doubt a lack of direction and of innovative ways of thinking. At the beginning, a theory has a disruptive, revolutionary effect, thus enriching the existing conceptual apparatus. This happens at least at first, when it is able to supply, at least potentially, some interpretations of the reality under study that are more compelling than preceding theories. However, if a theory is unable to supply all or part of the explanations for the phenomenon it studies in a reasonable time, it inevitably slides into such dryness and self-defeat that its studies and experiments become repetitive and unfruitful. It becomes, in other words, a dead theory, even when studies and experiments continue to be performed. What is actually happening is a decoupling of the initial idea from the ensuing concepts and related experiments, so creating a dynamism where the supporting idea drifts more and more towards a metaphysical dimension where it is stored as an acquired fact, safely protected from any criticism and verification. At this point, all the subsidiary hypotheses, together with the pile of fruitless experiments, tends to amplify themselves uselessly to infinity. Let us take as an example the metaphysical hypothesis: the God Vishnu exists because he heals his creatures with the elements of the universe, with the sun, the water, and earth. And let us try to demonstrate scientifically that this corresponds to the truth. What would scientists do to confirm this hypothesis? Undoubtedly, they would set up 2 tracks of research, an epidemiological one and one treating the chemistry and physics. The size of such research projects would be more or less a function of the monetary support coming in from around the world. It could be expected that in the richest nations like the United States, scientists would start by calculating the intensity of light or its refraction index in relationship to various areas of territory and relation to the measured medium height and weight of a certain number of individuals taken as a representative sample from different cities. Epidemiological studies would then be set up in different areas of the country and would be extended to the composition of water and earth in relation to the circumference of the abdomen or limbs of individuals, and so on. The molecular variations of each metabolic process in relation to the leanness or fatness of the individuals would be studied in the lab, as well as the genetic differences of various receptors, which could be the cause of a malfunctioning metabolism, and so on. The only guarantee expected from this experimental plan would be to observe the strictest methodological rigor with particular respect to the accuracy of measurements, the adoption of accepted criteria of evaluation in terms of margin of error, confidence intervals, quality of evidence, scrupulousness of interviews, relationship to published studies, and the prerogative of the repeatability of experiments, and thus the sharing of results with the international academic world. Although the example of the god Vishnu is clearly absurd, the procedure described could be applied in an attempt to demonstrate the genetic theory. This demonstration is as impossible as it would be to demonstrate the existence of Vishnu by measuring and studying the world in any conceivable way. They both remain an object of faith. This statement can be clarified with some simple considerations. There are 2 basic assertions around in the thinking about research and oncological theory around which the thinking about research and oncological theory rotates. The first hypothesis is that the uncontrolled growth comes from an alteration of the mechanism of growth caused by a degeneration and therefore by a malfunctioning of the genes. The other assertion is descriptive to the effect that a tumor is a mass of cells that tend to grow more and more. Since the latter assertion is a statement of fact and the former a hypothesis, which intends to demonstrate that fact, a further interpretive step is necessary. A further hypothesis is prepared that supplies more detail. The alteration of cellular growth is due to a phenomenon of exaggerated cellular multiplication. This hypothesis, in turn, needs further explanatory elements. What are the causes that determine such uncontrolled multiplication? The further explanatory hypothesis is that multiplication is determined by a malfunctioning of some segment of the DNA pertaining to the genes, in particular the genes that are responsible for producing those molecules needed for cellular multiplication. The malfunctioning is then attributed to, another hypothesis, molecular damage, or rather to an endless and at the moment unknown series of episodes of molecular damage. Why does all this damage occur? What are the factors that determine it? Now further explanatory hypotheses identify a series of possible generators of molecular alterations operating in hyperplastic functions such as growth factors, hormones, toxic substances, radiation, viruses, dietary deficiencies, hereditary factors, immunological dysfunctions, excessive neuropsychiatric stress, and others. It is clear that of the first 4 of the 14 hypotheses that we have mentioned are exclusively theoretical, while the others, by being more specific, can be subject to experimentation. One can see right away that this is an impossible enterprise, since the number of possible elements for study are almost endless. Just think of all the enzymes and proteins that are in a cell, or the myriad of toxic substances that may act on it. Furthermore, a deeper analysis of the first basic assertions, that is, that a tumor is due to an alteration of the mechanism of growth, highlights the fact that this assertion is made up of different concepts. The implicit one, tacitly taken for granted, is that the cell mass tends intrinsically to continue to grow. The hypothesis that this happens because of a gene malfunction, the hypothesis that this is caused by the degeneration of the genes at the molecular level, the hypothesis that the malfunction determines the cellular multiplication that is out of control. So these are all hypotheses. What is to be demonstrated here is not just the base assertion, but also its constituent propositions. Consequently, experiments can be conducted for each constituent proposition with the result that each experiment remains confined and does not relate to the others because of the infinite number of elements that can come into play. For example, a line of experiments may concern the characteristics of cellular growth, such as the measurable entity, the degree, or the quality of the subtypes in reproduction, differential relationship with the different types of cancer, and so on. A second approach for research might concern which genes are malfunctioning in various neoplasms, so that they can be classified as oncogenetics. Another approach might be to research the synergy of the various genetic clusters to study over a much longer period of time, years or decades, including the process of in vitro immortalization in relationship to carcinogenesis. The study of the endless number of toxic factors capable of triggering molecular alterations is another investigative path not to be disregarded. From the above, one can clearly understand why the genetic theory on cancer is never able to reach any conclusion and/or positive results. By experimenting ad infinitum on an infinite number of phenomena, it can only be inconclusive and have no real usefulness. Genetics and cancer have nothing to do with each other, or as Hume says, either a demonstration is irresistible or it has no power at all. Heidegger adds, a river of words of an argument does nothing but obscure what is to be understood, giving it the appearance of clarity that comes from cunning and banalization. Okay, so I'm going to continue on with Dr. Tullio Simoncini's book, Cancer is a Fungus, and I'm trying to be as amusing as I possibly can about this so that you understand why the gene theory of cancer is a fraud and how it's very, very misleading. So you have to concentrate because it's very weighty, but it's really, really worth the consideration because you begin to see why we have the problems healing cancer. So the conclusion is that the experimental method, even when utilized in the best of ways, comes to no result when it serves an empty idea that is metaphysical and never demonstrable. Demonstrable? It is therefore useless to wag one's finger or boast of possessing a scientific method that guarantees nothing. Not only is this senseless, it is also at the same level, although in a more educated form, as that of charlatans and of those who try to find the cure for cancer by moving pendulums or by the laying on of hands. Now, since I was studying how Jesus did the miracles, I sort of take exception to this. Except he's saying, if you're talking about scientific method, so when you say how did Jesus do the healings, you're not implying that you're using a scientific method. But if you are, and then in truth it is no more than that, then you have to consider it. Because look at the cover of his book. It's just very loving. It's two hands holding somebody, ostensibly of the sick person. So it's not like he doesn't have that sympathy of love. But you just have to isolate what you're talking about. Are you talking about a scientific method, or are you talking about something else? So now this this picture is just illustrating the suffering that he and other doctors go through when they watch people dying of cancer, and what a monstrous disease it is. And that's something that you want to have in mind to fortify you to go forward to try to figure this out, because it is figurable, outable. Before refuting genetics, however, it is necessary to understand to what extent genetic explanations have truth, so that it is possible once and for all to unmask the fallacy of this approach, and consequently the absurdity of proposing therapeutic systems anchored to this void. What then is genetics? What does it propose? On what certainties is it based? What do the sacred books say? And finally, what certainties does it offer to the patient? That's the most important thing. What does genetics offer to the patient? We should emphasize that these are not just theoretical issues, but penetrate to the essential foundations of official oncological therapies, therapies that would be disqualified if the inconsistency of the principles and the deductions of genetics are demonstrated. The demonstration of the lack of foundations of genetics would have as consequence the disappearance of the current oncological therapies, and with it enormous and useless research programs which are capable of producing only bundles of ifs, which dangerously abuse the conditional tense. To better understand the underlying dynamics of a proposed anti-cancer therapy, it is perhaps useful to create an example of using a hypothetical dialogue between an oncologist and a patient. And I think this is really, really clever of Simoncini, because this is when people are making up their minds when they're in the doctor's office. I'm going to read something else about how to talk to your doctor, coming from the orthomedics people. But for now, let's listen to how Simoncini describes it. Patient: Doctor, why should I undergo an operation as well as chemotherapy and radiotherapy? Doctor: because you see, there is a cell here, and that has started to proliferate and to reproduce out of control. Since some of its genes have acquired such characteristics as not to have a limit in transmuting reproductive signals, and these signals are boundless, if we could destroy the mass of the disintegrated cells with chemotherapy and radiotherapy, or through surgical separation, then we could obtain highly positive results. That's what the doctor's saying. Patient: so the whole problem is the destruction of the sick cells. Doctor: correct. And this today is a goal that we can attempt to reach in several ways. You see, research today has taken giant steps. Besides the therapies I have mentioned, there is also immunogenetics with active immunotherapy, genetic therapy, and monoclonal antibodies, as well as hormone therapy, which is particularly effective with hormone-sensitive tumors, such as those affecting the breast or prostate. Furthermore, we have anti-angiogenic therapy, which by preventing, no, I don't want you to drink my milk. Come on. Okay. Persistent there. Come on. We're learning about gene therapy. Yes. Okay. Furthermore, we have anti-angiogenetic therapy, which by preventing the generation of new blood vessels feeding the tumor tends to make it regress by starvation. And let's not forget a whole series of immunostimulant substances which are capable of changing and powering up the response of the immunological system towards those cells that escape the process of regulated growth. Patient: no doubt one can be reassured by such advanced scientific knowledge which penetrates so far into the depth and into the intimacy of the most delicate cellular reproductive mechanisms, Doctor. This patient is really picking up on the lingo. Doctor: certainly. Just think, for example, that by using monoclonal antibodies, we are able to hit one single peptide or a single anomalous protein with extreme precision. as if we were using a micro laser or a micro scalpel. Imagine that through gene therapy we are able to transfer a suicidal gene into the diseased cells so that we can expose them more easily to destruction by an anti-neoplastic drug, and so on. Patient. So I may hope, therefore, to find a winning solution most appropriate for my case in the combination of therapeutic components, Doctor. I just hope you can find out what really works best for my disease. Doctor, don't worry. I'm sure that we'll find the best way to solve your case using the new methods of investigation and the work of the specialists in the field. Patient. Fiat voluntas Dei. May the will of God be fulfilled. Okay, we observe 3 significant points in the above dialogue. 1, all therapies are based on a presumed genetic degeneration, which in turn is responsible for the unregulated reproduction of cells. 2, the methods and studies of the research which are observed by a massive number of scientists actually seem very advanced and sophisticated. 3, the patient may rely on the work of a great number of specialists capable of using specialized structures and instruments. The natural question is this enough? Is this a guarantee for the health of the cancer patient? The answer is absolutely not, because it is all false. Parades of grandeur such as these are worthless when they are based not on certainties but only on undemonstrated hypotheses. If not, nobody has ever demonstrated a link. In fact, nobody has ever demonstrated a link between cellular hyperproduction and cancer, between mutagenesis and malignant transformation, between hyperproductive cellular effects observed in vitro and cancers occurring in flesh and blood patients. The reality of a laboratory is one thing. The reality of life is another. The presentation by official medicine of inconsistent theoretical oncological positions as truth is not acceptable. They are sold to us as based on acceptable logical structures, while it is well known that they, at the start, are failures. Let us take, for example, what is written in Oncological Medicine, and this is Bonadonna G. Rubustelli G. Edizione CEA Milan 1999. So keep in mind this is an Italian oncologist, so he's quoting Italian textbooks. And even in translation, wow. In the explanation of the metastasization process on page 164, we read, "From what we have shown so far, it is evident," he has that bold, "it is evident that aside from mechanical factors such as the dimensions of the cells and of the vessel channel as well as cellular deformation, the selectivity for specific vascular locations is tied to the mechanism of adhesions to the vessel's walls, to the type of degranulation enzymes produced by the neoplastic cell and of inhibiting enzymes present in the tissue of the vessel, to chemiotactical and apoptactical factors that drive the establishment of the single cell in optimal locations for proliferation, to autocrine and paracrine growth factors, and to the possibility of initiating and maintaining the angiogenesis process. From the above, it is clear that what we state about the lack of soundness of the basis of oncological therapies is already shared by others. On the same page concerning the mechanism of migration and growth on a vascular basis, we read, "The molecular basis of the phenomenon are not known." And again, on page 160, the angiogenesis process finally occurs when metastasization has taken place already. So it seems circular. In summation, the phrase, "it is evident that," is loaded only with negative outcomes. Thus it is substantially false, as, after all, is the rest of oncology, the theories of which, in synthesis, foresee the existence of the following pathogenic factors, phenomenon. A, alteration of genes and chromosomes. B, molecular alterations. C, neoplastic cellular transformation mediated by the hormones. D, neoplastic cellular transformation mediated by growth factors. E, cellular transformation favored by a state of immunodeficiency. The hypothesis of uncontrolled proliferation, UP, would depend, therefore, on the convergence of the 5 above-mentioned factors. A, in the first case, the uncontrolled proliferation would be explained by phenomenon A, which in turn is explained by phenomenon B, and so on down the line. In the second case, the uncontrolled proliferation would be explained by the simultaneous actions of all the factors in play. Schematically, and then he shows UP is less than A, less than B, less than C, less than D, less than E, meaning one's caused by the other. Or 2, UP uncontrolled proliferation is A plus B plus C, and so on. Let us consider, however, what is reported in the work we have cited above concerning the factors mentioned, and this is really the good parts here. Factor A, page 7, third paragraph, the mechanism throughout which chromosomal alterations occur to date is unknown. Okay? Factor B, page 137, last paragraph. A more direct use of molecular lesions in a therapeutic sense seems still uncertain today. Factor C, page 385. The various methodologies employed in the attempt to discriminate the hormone-dependent forms, both in the mammary carcinoma and in the neoplasias, have only given approximate indications. Factor D, end of page 124. In spite of the biological interest in this class of proto-oncogenes, no growth factor has so far been demonstrated to be structurally involved in the genetic lesions of human tumors. Factor E, page 157. The immunological specific therapy of human tumors, which is the ultimate goal of every immuno-oncology research, is currently more potential than it is actual. What emerges then is that according to the multi-phase consequential model, the base hypothesis UP is explained, that's uncontrolled proliferation, is explained by the unknown phenomenon A, which is explained by the unknown phenomenon B, in turn explained by the unknown C, and so on, to the point where any number of unknown phenomenon can be added to their endless chain. In the second case, hypothesis UP, uncontrolled proliferation, is explained through the convergence of many phenomenon, which are also all unknown. From what has been explored so far, it is clear that regardless of the method of explanation used, since all factors are unknown, the main hypothesis of oncology remains a mystery, as it is still anchored to the formidable mechanism of multifactoriality, which is able to explain everything without knowing anything. When faced with such illogical logic, it is natural to question whether the formulation of the fundamental hypothesis of oncology possesses the requisites for a rational proposition, or if at least it corresponds descriptively to the truth. But there we are hit by a surprise. A tumor is constituted by different populations from the kinetic point of view, as the proliferating cells are often a minority. In solid tumors, instead, the exponential rate of growth takes place only during the initial phase of the life of the tumor. And that, again, he quotes the Italian authors of the Italian Oncology textbook, Bonadonna, Rubistelli, page 72. The fundamental principle or hypothesis upon which all of oncology rests is, therefore, clearly false, because A, it is deprived of a rational truth since it does not rest on a non-contradictory principle. Hyperplasia, the abnormal growth of cells, is and is not admitted at the same time. 2, it is deprived of a sufficient reason because since all the facts or explanatory phenomenon are unknown, it does not exist for any factual reason. Aristotle says, On the other hand, it is just because we know that an object exists that we are looking for the reason why it is. It is instead difficult to understand an object when we do not know that it is. Schopenhauer comments, "What's the use for explanations that ultimately lead to something which is as unknown as the original problem was?" In conclusion, a non-existent fact is explained with unknown phenomenon, and furthermore, the base hypothesis of a genetic causality intended to explain neoplastic hyperproduction is reduced to a forced conclusion. That forced conclusion consists of the fact that the mechanisms proposed for the normal productive cellular activity of the body, in simple words, that which occurs every day, would, for unspecified causes, assume at a certain point a behavior which is contrary to that which generally occurs in the tissues. When considered through this distorted lens, then, the very same genes that normally have a positive role in cellular reproduction are defined as proto-oncogenic, and instead those that inhibit the reproduction are called suppressor genes or recessive genes. For example, the gene on which the thyroid hormone normally depends, a gene that is produced every day, at a certain point and without reason, and here is the mystery that supports all the research, becomes anomalous and has repercussions on the growth cycle. This is tantamount to hypothesizing that the mouth, an organ presupposed to consumption and the mastication of food, at a certain point of life and all of a sudden gets utilized to bite and chew one's own hands. That's how much sense that makes. But if the processes of the disease are unknown, the base hypothesis of oncology has no verification in reality, since the presupposition of the hypothesis is a forced interpretation, thus an invention. In practice, if all levels of the system are falsified, then it is hard to understand why an idea which is totally bankrupt continues to be sustained. The mysterious and complex genetic factors, the monstrous reproductive ability of a pathological entity capable of deconstructing any tissue, the implicit ancestral tendency of the human organism to deviate in a self-destructive direction, and many other similar arguments seasoned with vast numbers of ifs and perhaps, combined in exponential ways, can no longer satisfy anybody, as they are only a lunatic's ravings. Kary Mullins, the Nobel Prize scientist who discovered the PCR, a method of DNA amplification, in an interview by Celia Farber, published in the July 1994 issue of Spin, strongly criticized those in the scientific community who spread lies passing them as scientific data. And this is what he says, he's quoted here. "I observe those people studying oncogenes and think, yes, I know what they are doing, the usual trash. Oncogenes have nothing to do with cancer." Why do scientists continue to promote such a baseless idea? What is driving scholars to continue to possess such a wacky theory? The only logical motive possible might be the force of habit. Kant says, "Where someone should be even silent and confess his ignorance, he considers as known what he knows because of frequent and familiar use. He imagines he sees and knows what his own apprehension and hopes push him to admit and believe." I'm going to take... And he ends with the story of, because this reminds us of the story of the drunk who's looking for his keys. And he's looking around on the street and someone says, "Oh, what are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys." "And where'd you lose them?" "Oh, I lost them on the other side of the street." They say, "Well, why aren't you looking on the other side of the street?" And he says, "Because there's more light here." So, it is in this way that science works, comments Noam Chomsky. It looks where there is light, because it is the only thing that it can do. In this way, error can dominate for centuries and impose on entire populations its iron yoke, says Schopenhauer. So there you go. I know for me that certainly satisfied putting to rest the gene theory of cancer. In other words, my mom had it, my sister has it, we all get it. It's not satisfactory to really curing the problem.